In this lesson, we're going to talk about using the location manager in the emulator and how to make that work properly. If you remember in our last lesson, we were working with this application, which started getting a location, stopped getting a location, and got our last current location. This line here was getting the last known location from our location manager. I mentioned at that time that I had to do a little bit of magic to get this to work with the emulator. The emulator, of course, doesn't really have a GPS in it, which is what's behind all of these location manager calls. So essentially we have to emulate it. The way we can do that is to use a tool called DDMS. And the DDMS is an Android tool rather than a mono tool, and you can find it in your user's app data, local, Android, Android SDK, tools, under a DDMS batch file. It looks like this, and it has a whole lot of interesting information, and it gives you a lot of debug information down to the root of the emulator. So it's a very interesting tool in general, but we're just going to talk about the emulator control at this point. You first select your emulator, and then go over to the Emulator Control tab. And there's a lot of things that we can do here in terms of telephony, but we're interested in the location controls. And what I did in the last lesson was I just set in a manual location. That longitude and latitude ought to look somewhat familiar, and I just sent it to the application. And when we ran the application, we saw it get that latitude and longitude. So this is important because we'd like to fully test our code in emulation rather than being forced into using a device for a portion of the code. And we certainly don't want to just fake this code to be able to pass in emulation. Now our application may expect that the user moves, so we can do that using the tool as well, instead of just having a static last known location. Because essentially, this call works, and our on location changed will happen once. But that's all. So that makes testing a little bit more difficult because we'd want to force that on location changed more often in certain application scenarios. So we can create a file to simulate multiple points. This is called a KML file, and we can enter individual place marks. We can give them a name and some coordinates, and we can actually give them a description as we like as well. So I've put in Knoxville and Nashville. I would not guarantee that these are actually correct. And if I go into DDMS and use the KML tab, I can load the KML file, and it gets the listings, including an elevation field. And down at the bottom here are the play buttons. So I'm going to bring up the emulator and run the application. And first you can see the call stack of the application being run. And again, that's down at the Java level rather than the mono level. That may be interesting in the case of a hard-to-find sort of garbage collection error or something that gets down into the root operating system as opposed to a .NET framework problem. So I'm going to move this to the side so we can take a look at the emulator when I play that KML. So we're going to start getting locations, and now I'm going to play it. And there you can see the locations have changed. So that's how to use the location manager on the emulator and emulate the GPS. You can make this KML script as long or as short as you like in order to simulate whatever scenario your application needs.